Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for an MP webinar covering employee handbooks, common mistakes every employer should avoid. I'm Katie Kreider, marketing specialist here at MP. For those of you joining us on a webinar for the first time, MP is a full-service human capital management company. We offer a complete suite of products and services to support organizations through the entire employee lifecycle, including recruiting, HR, payroll, benefits administration, time and attendance, and compliance assistance. We support our clients with cutting-edge technical solutions, as well as proactive, reliable service and a deep HR and payroll expertise. At MP, we are wired for HR and help our clients succeed by aligning their people strategy with their business goals. I'm excited to introduce your presenter for today's program, Donnie Pangburn. Donnie has a fundamental certification through SHRM. He has over 15 years of experience in human resource management with an emphasis on employee and leadership development, talent acquisition, benefits administration, and employee relations. Donnie has passionately mentored many interns seeking a career in human resources and is an advocate of continuing education. Donnie earned his Bachelor's of Education with an emphasis in orchestral, wind ensemble music. He has spent numerous years in a human resource management role within call contact centers, law firms, and the healthcare industry prior to joining MP. Donnie's goal is to obtain his SPHR certification by 2022 year end. And just a few housekeeping issues before we get started here today. If you would like to submit a question during the program, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We will be sending out the recording of the webinar later today along with the slides. To ensure that your company is prepared for year end, I'm going to drop a link into the chat for you to book a meeting with an HR professional or learn more just about MP. So with all of that, I'm going to hand the mic off to Donnie.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donnie. I'm so happy to be here to be your presenter, your MC, your facilitator, your master of ceremonies. Talk about handbooks. We're getting close to the end of the year. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to make sure that all of our handbooks are lined up and ready to go for the beginning of 2023. I don't know about you, but I can't believe that we're already to the end of 2022. This year has gone by so fast. But enough about that. I do have a disclaimer for you. This training is intended for educational and informational purposes. And while I do hope that you learn a lot today, I'm not an attorney, and the information should not be construed as any type of legal advice. Information in the presentation is updated. Be sure to check with federal, state, and local jurisdictions for the most updated guidance. So let's take a look at the different topics that we're going to cover today. We're just going to jump right in there. So we're going to cover, well, why in the world do I need an employee handbook? What am I supposed to include in that handbook? Some policy updates that are coming down the pipeline for 2023, and the top 10 handbook mistakes to avoid. So an employee handbook provides employees a detailed overview of policies that are going to be specific to your company, along with other key guidelines and benefits. In a nutshell, though, it does set clear expectations for your employees while also stating your legal obligations and defining employee rights. An employee handbook can help protect your business against employee lawsuits and claims such as wrongful termination, harassment, and discrimination. The handbook is also a crucial introduction to your business for new hires, providing insights to your company's mission, values, and culture. In addition to communicating expectations, the employee handbook can help with compliance with state and federal laws, be a go-to resource for your employees, and showcase company benefits. Most importantly, it's a tool for managers to deal with workplace issues and ensures consistency and fairness in applying workplace rules. If you've ever had to defend your company in an employment situation, having a handbook that you have given, reviewed, And the employee's acknowledged can be a key defense should the employee claim you did not convey the standards of conduct. And then the employee was terminated for violating the policy. A company looks more buttoned up, if you will, and professional in a court of law, and can be more professional to the employee. And we all know it's hard to attract and retain employees currently in November, almost December of 2022. One size does not fit all. So when it comes to handbooks, it's important to remember that one size doesn't fit all. It may be tempting to use a handbook from a company that you've worked for in the past, or a handbook from a friend's company, but you really want to make sure that handbook reflects the needs of your current company. So you need to consider the company size, number of employees. Many employment laws kick in when you reach a certain head count, and you want to make sure your handbook isn't forcing your hand to comply with employment laws that you don't necessarily need yet. So for example, if you borrow a handbook from a friend who owns a company with 75 employees, that handbook is most likely going to have a policy for the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act, the FMLA. If your business has less than 50 employees, you're not considered a covered employee under the FMLA, and you wouldn't need to follow that policy. However, if it's in your handbook, you could be on the hook for providing unpaid leave to your employees. You also want to consider your employee locations in the states in which you operate. Employment laws are based on where the employees perform in the majority of their work. So that means in addition to any brick and mortar physical operations, you also want to think about any states where you have remote employees working from home. Again, for an example, if you have offices in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and remote employees working from home in California and Pennsylvania, you'll want to make sure you have handbook addendums for all 4 states. Also keep in mind, this includes setting up things like payroll taxes, unemployment, and workers' compensation in the states where your employees are working. Your industry may have specific laws to follow, for instance, transportation with DOT laws. You also want to think about your specific industry, whether or not your company is a government contractor, whether or not your company is unionized. And you want to think about workforce in terms of diversity, various employment categories, telecommuters, remote workers, literacy, language, and disability. Diversity, obviously, is the key to all organizations. You may have a DEI policy, employment categories such as full-time, part-time, seasonal, interns. If you have employees working from home or maybe on a hybrid schedule, have a policy on what is expected, what you can cover as an employer. If your population has multiple languages, consider putting in multiple languages disability policies. That's going to be important to convey to employees will not be discriminated on the base of any type of disability or employment status, such as race, religion, gender, etc. So some of those handbook do's and don'ts. So I'm just going to provide you a few tips regarding some of those do's and don'ts for your handbook. It is important to put your policies in writing, but sometimes too much detail is not needed. For example, when it comes to policies regarding your benefits, suggest putting a high-level summary, letting employees, letting them know which benefits that you offer, and then refer to the summary plan documents for details, as those items are subject to change, obviously. Make sure you're applying policies consistently. This is the key. If you let some employees use sick time as vacation time and not others, then you have a problem. So if you don't follow what's in the handbook, your practice becomes your policy, and then it's hard to enforce anything that's in the handbook. An employee or their lawyer could argue, how did the employee know that they should or shouldn't do something in a policy if the company doesn't follow other policies within that handbook? Make sure you are communicating your handbook policies to all employees. If you're a client of MP, you can make the handbook available to employees in iSolved for electronic acknowledgement. And it's always a good idea to communicate changes made to policies as they occur, especially when new laws come into effect in particular states. It's very easy to do when you have an electronic handbook as opposed to having to reprint and destroy outdated copies that may be floating around. If you want to learn more about how we do that here at MP, feel free to send us a message. You can also look me up on LinkedIn and send me a message as well, and I'll be happy to provide you additional information. You want to make it easy to read, of course. Yet remember that there are reasons that policies are written as they are, especially when it comes to employment laws. We don't want to treat a handbook like an operations manual. Those should be separate from your handbook. So for instance, the checklist of what an employee needs to do at the opening of a shift and the end of the shift, that's operational. So in the handbook under standards of conduct, you would say something like that employees need to follow guidance from management or procedures set forth in their role. So here are some must-haves and must-not-haves. So when we look at the at-will language versus contractual language, you want to make sure that your handbook includes at-will employment language if it applies to your state specifics and doesn't include any language that could make an employee think that their employment is contractual. At-will employment means that there is no employee contract and the employee or the employer is free to end the employment relationship at any time for any reason. You want to make sure you avoid using terms that imply job security or job guarantees, such as successfully passing your probationary period or long rewarding career with the company. You also want to avoid using the term permanent employment. If you also hire temporary employees and want to differentiate between the two, it's going to be best to say regular full-time employee or regular part-time employee to indicate an employee who is regularly scheduled to work. It's also a good idea to explicitly state that the handbook is not a contract. You retain the right to revise the employment relationship. The handbook is a policy guide that can be revised anytime and that you will communicate any changes as they arise. What are we going to include in our employee handbook? Well, you can use the handbook as an opportunity to tell your company's story. A handbook can create a first impression for a new hire, letting them know what you're doing as a company through your culture, your mission, your values, your goals. It's best practice to include an employee relations policy, sometimes called an open door policy, and you want employees to feel comfortable speaking to their managers or leaders all the time, but especially if they have concerns or issues. We want to encourage open communication to keep issues from becoming ticking time bombs. It's also important to be mindful of gender neutral language throughout the handbook. Subtle changes like this can really make a huge difference in making employees feel comfortable and accepted. So there are compliance policies, and those are going to be required policies that we really don't want to modify since they aren't specific to anyone's specific company. The EEO statement and the discrimination and harassment policies are big ones, which can be state specific, but I'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple slides. Drug-free workplace, including drug testing and substance abuse. This includes language regarding the use of medical marijuana or prescription medicine. It's good to have a policy that states employees cannot be impaired at work, even if they are legally allowed to use these drugs outside of work. Excuse me. You also want to have policies around compensation, including wage and hour information, such as state laws regarding overtime and how often employees need to be paid. You want to include that as an employer, you are required to include paycheck deductions, such as state disability insurance. Policies regarding employee safety. You may be able to keep this general, but you want the employees to report any safety issues or concerns, or making sure they know who to reach out to if they get hurt at work. If you're in a safety sensitive industry that uses a lot of heavy machinery or other potentially hazardous equipment, you may need a very detailed safety manual that would be separate from your handbook. Some of those workplace policies we're going to talk about that are going to be specific to, for instance, attendance requirements. So you want to be specific about how employees are to communicate if they're going to be out or late. Also, you want to include a no-call, no-show statement. This is going to let the employee know if they do not report to work, for instance, for 3 consecutive days without informing you, this may be considered a voluntary resignation of their position, which means this is not a termination on the company's part. The employee basically is quitting. And so in this day and age, with technology making it much easier to communicate, we've seen more companies shorten the no-call, no-show policy to even 2 days. Your standards of conduct and performance are going to be very important, to include items such as no stealing or falsification of time cards. You want to follow safety protocols and not violating things like the harassment, workplace violence, drug and alcohol policies. And then when we come to electronic technology, you want to make sure that you have a policy that covers the use of company computers and other equipment. Whether you want to be specific that they should be used for work purposes only, and letting employees know that they shouldn't assume anything is private, even if password protected. You also want to let the employees know you will not tolerate harassment of employees, clients, customers, visitors, vendors via electronic technology. And this does include social media. This can be an issue if it creeps into the workplace. Even though it's happening outside of work on the employee's own time, you can take action if it's impacting your workplace. You want to make sure that you're including benefit information, such as vacation time or your PTO, sick time, holiday policies. And as I mentioned, for anything with a summary plan document, like your medical, dental, vision, you want to keep those policies high level. You can have a policy about handling confidential or sensitive information that's applicable for all employees. And that's definitely a good practice. But keep in mind, if you need a non-disclosure agreement for certain roles, that would be outside your handbook. So here are some of the policy updates coming down the pipeline. So we'll get into these and we'll take a closer look about equal employment opportunity, workplace harassment, your PFML, your paid sick leave, equal pay and wage discrimination, substance use, and testing. And so, as I have mentioned previously, it is important to keep in mind that employment policies are tied to where your employees perform the majority of their work. So if your business is located in New Hampshire, and over the past year you hired 1 remote employee in California, you'll need to make sure your handbook includes relevant policies for that 1 employee. And so with that in mind, let's begin with equal employment opportunities. So at the federal level, applicants, employees, and former employees are protected from employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, including pregnancy, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, age for those who are 40 and over, disability, and genetic information, including family medical history. So applicants, employees, and former employees are also protected from retaliation for filing a charge or a complaint of discrimination, participating in a discrimination investigation or lawsuit, or opposing that discrimination. As you see here in this chart, it shows the claims filed with the EEOC. This was from 2021. You'll notice that the percent totals are over 100, and that's because claims are often filed under multiple categories. The 2021 data does show that retaliation continued to be most frequently filed, the data shows that retaliation continued to be the most frequently filed charge with the agency, followed by disability, then race, and then sex. Many states also have expanded protected classes, including marital status, HIV and AIDS status, observance of the Sabbath, political activities, arrest records, or use of a service dog. So you do want to make sure that you're including the equal employment and anti-harassment policies for each state where you have employees and that they are up to date. So while this isn't necessary within your handbook, we do think it's important and it's worth mentioning that in addition to EEO and anti-harassment policies, there are 7 states in the District of Columbia require training on the prevention of harassment in the workplace. Each state is slightly different when it comes to who is considered a covered employer and employee and what must be included in the content of that specific training. So for example, in California, employers with 5 or more employees anywhere, not just in California, must provide 1 or 2 hours of interactive training to their California-based employees, depending on whether the employee has supervisory responsibilities. Colorado, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Vermont encourage training, but it isn't currently required. Training is considered a best practice when not required. It's always a good idea to make sure that your employees know your harassment policy and how to report incidents of harassment if they occur. So when employees feel that their employer takes complaints seriously, they're more likely to come forward before a situation gets out of control or before filing that complaint with the EEOC or any state agency. When we refer to the family medical leave laws or the FMLA, these require eligible employers to provide unpaid family leave. However, unlike nearly all other industrialized nations, the US does not have national standards on paid family or sick leave. In the absence of a federal policy, states have enacted their own paid family leave policies. Paid family leave laws provide parents and caregivers time off to address a serious health condition, including pregnancy, care for a family member with a serious health condition, address family circumstances arising from a military service member's deployment, or care for a newborn, a newly adopted child, or newly placed foster child. Currently, 11 states and Washington, D.C. have passed family and medical leave laws that are paid or can be paid through a state-run disability program. Colorado, New Hampshire, and Oregon have adopted paid leave programs that will begin in 2023, and employees in Maryland and Delaware will be eligible to take paid leave beginning in 2025 and 2026, respectively. So, in addition to making sure that you know if the state or states you operate in have state-mandated paid family or medical leave laws, you also want to determine how they interact with federal leave laws, as well as your own company leave benefits. Depending upon an employee's eligibility, these leaves may run concurrently, and you want to make sure employees are aware so they don't think they can take FMLA after their state leave has expired. So when we talk about the paid sick leave laws, this is going to allow for those workers to take time to attend doctor's appointments, pick up sick children from school, deal with issues related to sexual or domestic violence, accommodate public health emergencies and businesses or school closures, all with job protected time that they can accrue. New Mexico is the latest state to enact paid sick leave, and the law went into effect July 1st of 2022. In addition to the 16 states that offer paid sick time, there are other states that have city and or county paid sick leave laws that you should be aware of as well. Ultimately, you want to make sure that your handbook accurately reflects the paid sick leave laws that apply to your workforce. So we now have equal pay laws in all 50 states, and Mississippi was the last to pass in April of 2022. These equal pay laws include provisions on pay equity, pay history, and or pay transparency. Wage transparency laws prohibit employers from disallowing pay disclosures in the workplace and from retaliating against employees who discuss their pay with others. In theory, though, when employee compensation data is shared, collected, and reported freely, it promotes fair pay both within companies and across industries. There are 7 states that go even a step further, making salary history bans applicable to both public and private employers. So it's important for you to look at your handbook to ensure none of your policies violate these equal pay laws. For example, you want to make sure you have removed any policies that prevent employees from discussing their pay information. With substance abuse and use and testing, as of today, there's 21 states and Washington, D.C. have enacted legislation to regulate recreational use of marijuana, while it remains legal for medical purposes in 37 states. Many of these state-level laws include anti-retaliation provisions, which prohibit employers from using drug testing or the threat of a drug test to discourage the workers from reporting on-the-job injuries and illnesses. Specifically, OSHA said employers shouldn't administer blanket post-accident drug tests in situations when drug use likely did not cause the injury. Drug testing that is conducted to evaluate the root cause of a workplace incident that harmed or could have harmed employees is allowed if the employer tests all workers who could have contributed to the accident or the incident, rather than just the employees who reported the injury. You want to make sure your drug and alcohol policies, it doesn't contradict medicinal or recreational marijuana laws in the states in which you operate. So, top 10 handbook mistakes. So before we end, because you're so excited to start updating your policies and your handbooks, I do want to share some common mistakes that we do see time and time again when it comes to when creating handbooks. So here they are. Your top 10 handbook mistakes to avoid. Number 1, policies not matching practice. I feel like David Letterman right now with my top 10. Policies not matching the practice. This is so important and something I tell every client when we're starting to work on a handbook together. Policies are pretty useless when they only exist on paper and aren't reflected in the way you do business and manage your employees. This can actually harm you too. If you're trying to hold on to, or if you're trying to hold an employee accountable to a particular policy, but it turns out that you aren't practicing many of the policies in your handbook, it's going to be pretty hard to justify why you're trying to hold the employee accountable. So no cherry picking with your policies. Number 2, failing to train managers and supervisors. If your managers and supervisors haven't received training on your policies, it's going to be really hard for them to put your policies into practice and manage to those specific policies. Number 3, restrictive social media policies. While it's a good idea to have a set of guidelines surrounding employee social media use, employers do need to be careful that they aren't infringing on employee rights. Even employers without any union employees need to abide by the National Labor Relations rules when it comes to allowing employees to exercise their right to speak about working conditions. Number 4, not revising the handbook regularly. The handbook should be a living document because, as we all know, things change pretty rapidly, from new sick and family leave laws to your own internal practices. The best practice is to review your handbook annually to ensure it's up to date. You can make this less cumbersome for yourself and your employees by using electronic distribution and acknowledgement forms. We encourage all of our clients to make their handbook available through the employee self-service portal in iSolve, so it can be easily redistributed when any type of changes are made. Number 5, failing to include required policies. So while policies are not necessarily required in a handbook, there are certain notices that must be given to employees upon hire. So for example, in Massachusetts, all new hires need to receive the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act notice and a notice about earned sick time. So we strongly recommend you include these notices as handbook policies rather than having to remember to distribute them as a standalone notice to your employees. Number 6, one-size-fits-all approach. We talked about this a little bit. Some businesses may need different handbooks. There may be for different populations of employees. One for faculty, one for administrative staff at a private school, or different handbooks for exempt and non-exempt employees in a state with paid sick and family leave, and employees in a state without these benefits. Number 7, overly detailed discipline procedures. It's great to let employees know that you'll attempt to follow a progressive disciplinary process, but you want to make sure you aren't getting so detailed that you're stuck following a particular set of steps, rather than allowing you to use your discretion to handle incidents on a case-to-case basis. I once worked for a company that had a very rigid progressive disciplinary process that required a first, second, and then a final written warning, and it caused some problems when the circumstances of the situation warranted skipping to a final written warning. So you want to make sure you are allowing yourself that flexibility to apply the level of discipline that matches the severity of the unwanted behavior or that policy violation. And number 8, omitting at-will statement and disclaimers. Sometimes decision makers don't understand the importance of these sections of the handbook, and they want to omit them in an attempt to make the handbook shorter or to remove any legalese, if you will. But as I mentioned earlier, you want to make it clear that your handbook isn't a contract, and that employment is at will, and make it clear to employees exactly what that means. Obviously, if that applies to your state. Number 9, using a boilerplate handbook. So I've worked with a lot of clients who adopted a handbook from a previous employer, or they got a handbook from a friend who works at another company. And this can be a great starting off point, but you want to make sure that you are customizing your handbook to reflect your company's policies and practices. And lastly, number 10, failing to distribute the handbook. I have seen this happen more times than you probably want to know. You've spent a lot of time, you spent a lot of effort working to create and customizing your handbook, and it's reached to the point in time when it needs to get approved by someone who hasn't been involved in the process, but then it never gets formally approved. It's important to get buy-in from your leadership team so they know the importance of getting the handbook out to the employees. You can't expect your employees to follow your policies when they never receive a copy of your handbook. And I'll be happy to provide a copy of these slides too for you to go back to if needed. It does look like that we have a few questions as well. Let's see. All right, so the first question is, how specific do we have to be with a social media policy? Great question. So some employers include that catch-all social media policy in employee handbooks using vague, or maybe they use broad language. Well, a few years ago, General Motors, Target, and Costco were all called out by the NLRB for broad social media policies, which could be interpreted as prohibiting employee rights. So instead, employers should adopt specific social media policies rather than impose across the board things that could be prohibited. Let's see. When is too much or overkill with company policies? Good question. You don't allow your policies to dominate the handbook. You want to teach that value system that guides decisions. You want to make sure that they know the vision that inspires the contribution. Minimize referencing policies to a link where key policies are found. Make your handbook an inspirational and simple guide that's specific to your culture and value-based decision-making. Call it a culture book and inspire employees to read it constantly rather than dreading it. Got one more question. How do I write a handbook that employees can actually understand? Well, most handbooks, they're going to be written based on the, compliance, legalese, leaving employees confused. And then, of course, with HR, with the task of answering, a ton of questions, we can try instead to change the perspective of the handbook to what your employees need to know and not what you just want to tell them. Keep the compliance and the policy language separate. Employees, what they want is they want quick, straightforward answers and information telling them why they should even care. The primary rule of your handbook is risk mitigation. And while this may be true, keeping it useful and approachable and humanizing your language to reflect a supportive, engaging work experience, that's going to go a long way towards the adoption of your policies. So consider including the language your specific company adopts. So ladies and gentlemen, this is all I have today. This was a fairly short presentation. I want to thank you all very much for hanging out with me for a while. If there are additional questions that come through, I'll be more than happy to answer those questions as well and send those out to you with a copy of the presentation if you so choose to have a copy. Again, thank you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful Wednesday and a great weekend upcoming. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you, Donnie. To learn more about MP's HR services for 2023 and more, I did just drop a link into the chat that will connect you with the MP team member. You can also visit our website or call 774-266-6497 for more information. Be sure to join us next week on our upcoming webinar, 2022 ACA Reporting, Best Updates, and Best Practices. Visit our website to register and to see the full calendar of upcoming events and available resources. We will be sending out a recording of today's webinar along with the presentation slides this afternoon. Thanks for joining us and have a terrific day.